started thinking like the colonists to know the true our leaders started dropping it. The problem is we started thinking like the colonists to know the true our leaders started dropping.
You've had 4 of these major impacts that the black people have made to the Americas, not only before Columbus was born, but before even Spain or Italy existed. That's the kind of roots that are in this country. And by knowing that, and the more you know about it, it's an empowerment. You're really rooted. You have got a heritage which is more than slavery. Sure, there was slavery, but that's not all. That's a small part of it. Long before that, there's a heritage of kings, seafarers, religious missionaries, and they were all here. But it happened so long ago, there's just so little of it left.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
What connects it up is even the word Moor, because it's pronounced differently in different parts of even of Africa. And they call themselves Moor, Mu, Mur. There's all variations of that, so that even the name Mur.
And individuals are missing the point.
People will say, well, big deal, so what? Why is history important at all? History is extremely important. Imagine if I could take from each one of you as an individual everything you knew about life up to last week and just erase it. Where would you be? You'd be lost. You'd be incompetent. You wouldn't know how to plan for the future. And you do the same thing with a people. If you erase their history or you don't tell enough about their past, they also become incompetent and they can't fulfill the future. And that's why a lot of people in the black community have felt, well, how come all of the dreams of the civil rights movement aren't yet fulfilled? And one reason is because this history is still suppressed. It still isn't taught. But there's been a recent discovery which is going to blow the lid off of all that. And that's what I'm going to talk about.
100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. Now, have you ever wondered what that passage meant from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech? I did, and what I found was one of the biggest secrets that's not really a secret at all, except to many African Americans, is they are not descended from Africans.
Dr. King also stated in his I Have a Dream speech that we are held in exile in our own homeland.
100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
Now, we have a lot of scholars and etymologists out there, and individuals are missing the point. How can you be held in exile in your own homeland without it being your own homeland?
Moorish Americans are indigenous to America.
I know, I was shocked too, so much so that I asked Africans, and they agreed African Americans weren't Africans. If you don't believe me, Google Arnaldus Montanus America and see the people he saw in 1671. Read books like The Black American Handbook for Survival through the 21st Century by Radine Amin-Ra, What Every African American Should Know by Carrie Davis, and Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. I just can't believe schools aren't teaching this stuff. What a travesty.
And individuals are missing the point.
This is a tremendous lesson for us because, you know, we're so proud of our American civilization. We think it'll go on forever. But when a civilization falls, history tells us it takes almost all memory of it with it. Civilization is really very fragile. And that's why these lessons from the past are very, very important. If we want to preserve our civilization, we have to learn what happened to these others that crashed.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
We now know for a fact that long before Columbus, there were 4 major migrations of blacks to the Americas, different parts of the Americas, for totally different reasons, totally separated from each other by many centuries. But nonetheless, there were these black, you can call them migrations, but they were not entirely. I'll describe, and you can make up your own mind what they were. The most recent of these took place about 400 years before Columbus was even born, and it's all outlined in a marvelous book over there. It's called The Golden Trade of the Moors. And it is now known that the West African kingdom of Mali had huge fleets of merchant vessels, and that these kings, these black kings of West Africa, began sailing across the Atlantic to Mexico as early as 900 AD.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
But these Mali kings, 900 AD, they set out because they had a legend that there had been blacks going long before them. It was only a legend, it was only a myth, and it was on that myth that they chanced and they went across the sea and it worked out for them. But that myth traced all the way back to an even earlier black contact between Africa and America. And I'm talking about now not Mexico, but what we call now the United States.
The most important group or culture we have in Mexico,
and individuals are missing the point.
the most important group or culture we have in Mexico, well known as the Olmeca. Olmeca, 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 Olmeca. Where the bombs at? Yes, sir. I guess everybody knows, you know the subject, right?
Yes.
We have the Olmecs, but the Olmecs not from the Yucatan. The Olmecs from Veracruz, right?
Veracruz.
The Gulf of Mexico is where we have San Lorenzo, which is the most important site about the Olmecs. The Olmecs, one of the nicknames for the Olmecs in Mexico, it is Cultura Madre.
Cultura Madre.
Cultura Madre. You understand that?
For what?
Say it again.
Cultura Madre.
Madre, the mother of...
The mother of the cultures.
Okay.
Cultura Madre, the mother of the cultures, right? Because it is considered as the first, culture on this continent that so much people nowadays like to consider like almost a little bit more than 3,000 years before Jesus Christ. Break it down! But I guess, the most important thing to mention, right, it is that the Olmecs is still a mystery in Mexico. We say Olmecs, right? Yes. But some of the scholars nowadays like to consider that it is not relation. It is not relation in between that name with that people. Olmec means rubber people, right?
The Olmecs were a tribe in Africa called Dogon in Mali. When the Dogons migrated to America, they also imported the rubber tree, which is only indigenous to Africa. The Dogons used the sap from the rubber tree to make shoes, coats, capes, and they were the first to introduce soles on shoes in the New World. The name Olmec means rubber people. The rubber was also used to make large balls for the Olmecan ball game ceremonies, which was played in large stone arenas. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the West, he states that he saw natives kicking around a large ball that was made of some type of acacia. Columbus took some of these trees and balls back to Spain with him, and today, soccer is the favorite national sport of Spain. These Olmecs set up empires and cities that predates even the Inca, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. The Olmecs were not Siberians. The Olmecs were dark-skinned, big-lipped, wide-nosed Africans, just as they are portrayed in the stone monoliths. The step pyramids of Egyptians closely resembles the step pyramids found in the Americas. The double crown of Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt with the bird and the serpent is also found in Olmecan culture, with Upper and Lower Egypt being Northern and Southern America. The Mexicans have 4 calendars. The 4th calendar is identical to the Egyptian calendar. In Mexico, there was found a type of paper made from a specific type of wood pulp that scientists say can only be found in Egypt. Even the ceremonial dance of the Hopi Indians is identical to the Dogon's Bado dance of Africa, using the same symbols and spirit names. Various tribes such as the Osage and the Apache use the crescent moon symbol, which is the national symbol of Angola, Mauritania, Tanzania, the Sahara, and Algeria, all found on the continent of Africa.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
So we know for sure between 900 and 1600 AD, long before Columbus was even born, as I say, these blacks were trading, these black kingdoms were trading with Mexico.
And individuals are missing the point.
Those two black migrations to the Americas are not the only two. There are two more, two earlier ones still. We go way back in history. Around 1,000 years before Christ, 3,000 years ago. It's such a long time ago, it's hard to even imagine. There were people called the Phoenicians. These were Canaanite people that are mentioned in the Bible. They were half Semitic and half something else. Who knows what they were? They were very well traveled. They were very great seafarers. And they employed all kinds of races on their ships because they didn't really have any particular homeland. They were always traveling, went everywhere. They were the first to go around Africa, known to go around Africa, 900 BC. And it's known that they employed many blacks on their ships, not as slaves. They had no slaves on board their ships. But they did have sailors. They did have captains. These people definitely crossed the ocean also to Mexico. It made a very strong impact on a civilization called the Olmecs. The Olmecs, that's just as a name for this very, very early civilization. The earliest known civilization in Mexico. And everyone thought at one time, well, it's just an Indian civilization, until 1861. In 1861, a farmer was plowing his field, came across a very strange domed rock, a black rock, and he couldn't dig it out. The more he dug down, the bigger this rock got. Until he dug the entire thing away. It took him weeks to dig it away. And it turned out that he unearthed a 9-foot-high statue of a head, beautifully done, of an African, not an Indian at all the portrayed features of a West African man.
And individuals are missing the point.
Of an African, not an Indian at all the portrayed features of a West African man.
And individuals are missing the point.
From that time until recently now, there have been 11 of these giant stone heads. Let's see, I'll give you an idea how big they are. They're an average, well, there's 11 found now. They're between 6 and 9 feet high, and they weigh 40 tons apiece. They're magnificently carved.
In 1492, you came upon the shores. 700 years, educated by the Moors. 17th century, genocide in the gun. Middle passage blessed to market the Africans in the so-called lands of God. My kind were treated hard from back then until now, I see.
And individuals are missing the point.
While these were being found, more of the Olmec civilization was found, and a temple was discovered that had also the same type of people, these West African people portrayed as kings and warriors. So, when the first archaeologists found these, it says, well, these are probably just blacks that got blown across the sea and were enslaved. But you don't make huge heads portrayed with crowns of your slaves. You know, these were obviously regents, powerful people.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
The revelation of this hidden civilization reconstructed the indigenous history that has now been extended to reveal a hidden past. It is apparent that the Archaic period preceded even some of the great civilizations of the East, 900 to 400 BC. The people of this period were not primates. These archaic indigenous inhabitants belonged to a class of Homo sapiens, thus leading to the belief that the ancient America, despite the narrow-minded kaleidoscope view of cave dwellers and tree climbers, was a highly advanced civilization. We see this in the advanced artistry and sculpturing which was quite different than the art and sculpturing of tribal cultures. Mesoamerica archaeology proves enough data to suggest that these inhabitants were a high-status group with the presence of elite leaders, a military force, a political hierarchy, and a quite obviously, or at least sensible, penal system, as opposed to a primitive tribal culture's vigilante methods of punishment.
How did they get there that long ago? Because those heads are dated to about 3,000 years ago. So far as is known, there was no black civilization then. That came later. It appears that these were sailors and captains working with the Phoenicians. Maybe they jumped ships, maybe they got shipwrecked, but somehow they got along fine with this Olmec community, so much so that they rose to become the leaders of that society.
The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents. The first Africans to set foot on American soil were in fact the Dogons of Mali, who used such currents as the Canary and the North Equilateral Current that recycles from West Africa to America and into the upper Atlantic Ocean. This was before the invention of sails. The Guinea Current flows eastward along the Guinea coast, with frequent cycles out to the sea, where it joins the South Equatorial.
Now, basically, what science has now found, although this is suppressed for the most part, there have been some great researchers. You have some wonderful books there, like by Ivan van Sertima, who's talking about these things. This is not taught in your public schools, although it will be. The history that the children are learning today is not going to be history that's going to be taught in the next 25 years. It's going to be radically different.
If it escapes you, let me explain. The current American education states African Americans were brought to America as slaves from Africa, which is simply not true. They are American indigenous, not descendants of Africans. As they say, the truth is stranger than fiction. Although this fact isn't spoken of openly, it's not a secret. However, with programming such as Roots, 12 Years a Slave, The African American Story, and the Book of Negroes, is it any wonder why so many African Americans are confused? We won't address all the misleading DNA tests being provided to connect African Americans to Africa. So, the argument is, do they continue identifying as African Americans, which is a fake identity for them, or embrace being identified as indigenous Americans?
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
Are there any consequences of choosing one identity over the other?
William, that's a good question. According to African Americans Ain't Africans Facebook forum, identifying as African American is to quietly relinquish ancestral connections to America, connections that go back hundreds of thousands of years.
As an African American, we have no inalienable or indigenous rights under the Constitution. Even worse, as an African American Christian, we dig an even deeper hole for ourselves. As black Christians, we have to admit two things. We are former slaves by calling ourselves African, and we are former slaves who converted to the slave owner's religion. Thus, we sever any connection to sovereignty or self-identity.
I have no respect for Christianity to begin with. It's useless. It's a white man's religion. It was never meant for people of color and hue. I feel bad for black Christians because they're in for a sad awakening. All right? In fact, get the hell out now. Because when I'm done decimating Christianity, you're going to be running back to Egypt and Islam for solace, okay?
As African American Christians, we literally become dependent on the government and relinquish all indigenous and self-governing classifications. Thus, we throw ourselves on the mercy of the U.S. judicial system. Native Americans have what is called autonomy or self-government, similar to diplomatic immunity. As indigenous people, we have the right to set up our own sovereign nations. We govern our own judicial, legislative, and penal system. As African Americans, we waive the right of self-governing and indigenous rights by admitting that we are immigrants, came over from somewhere else.
But I know my roots. and I ain't Kunta Kinte.
And individuals are missing the point.
Africa is not our home. Let me let that hang in the atmosphere for a while. I said at this gathering of the masters, Africa is not your home.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
I'm a Moor, and got sense enough to know I'm a Moor. And ain't gonna never argue with you that I'm not a Moor. And wouldn't come in your house or come among you and say I'm a Moor if I didn't feel in my heart, in my mind, in my soul that I am.
If you don't understand that, get that together real quick.
And recognize how you've been miseducated, not just by Europeans, but by your own. These people know that you're not black. They don't doubt it. They know that you're not black. And they know that you're Moors.
Now it is a great Masonic secret that has long been revealed that it was George Washington who chopped down the cherry tree of the Moors, erasing them from the history books and removing their nationality, fez and turbans. It was even predicted that in a few hundred years many of them would not remember who they were or their connection to the land. It was Morocco who supported and gave rise to the independence of the United States of America as it has been recognized by President Obama.
The first nation to recognize my country was Morocco.
Bashar, and he also knows that North America is known as Al-Maghreb Al-Aqsa.
Of course, I know that. North America was known as Al-Maghreb Al-Aqsa, and it reported to the Sultan of Morocco.
But some adults have difficulty handling that. But that's the truth.
And there was a relation, this is why I needed to ask you, what's the relation between the first, colonials and the governors of Morocco? Because they communicated, because on paper it was part of Greater Morocco. That's known.
That's known.
It is often not talked about, but the Moors had enslaved the Europeans before they enslaved blacks. Their women were sold like commodities into the harems and as concubines of wealthy Moors. This is the reason why the Moorish noble were for the most part bleached out and became as tawny Moors, Turks and Arabs, which are no more than fixed mulatto races.
So it's very frustrating to try to prove that you're Native American. I found it frustrating for me because I was like, where is it? I know that I'm Islamic, that I'm Islamic, that I'm Islamic. And I know, well, Islamic, if you want to call it that.
This is also the reason for the Moors in the coats of arms of the noble European families, the so-called black nobility of Europe. The European nations paid tribute to the Moors well into the 18th century. In the book, The United States and Rivalry Powers, the English, French, Dutch, Danes, and Swedes, and may I say all nations, are tributary to them. David McRitchie in the book Ancient and Modern Britons says the word blackmail is the result of this tribute paid to the black army or black oppressors as the English referred to them. The Moors had control of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This is why the Marines sing of defeating the Moors, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, confirming the extent of the Moorish empire and dominions of Amexem or Atlantis.
And everybody knows that, but that kind of spoils the game that they've been playing on our people. You see the point?
Where even people living in a place may not necessarily do enough research. We live here in America, and black people don't know that there were blacks already here before blacks came here. So I'm saying no matter how much a person may live in a place doesn't necessarily mean that they know about the place from which they reside.